As I mentioned in our invitation, we are very excited to have Kevin Haley join us today, and I'll be talking about him in just a moment and then turning the line over to him. But again, my name is Mike Dunham, and I'm with Intuitive Technology Group, and we are a company that specializes in security, DevOps, and big data. And if you have time, we'd love to have you visit our website or give us a call. We'll have my contact information at the end of this meeting. But today's meeting is focused on security, and I want to get right into it. First of all, we've got a huge coup in having Kevin Haley available to us. Kevin is a director over product management at Symantec, but more importantly, you probably have seen his name in the paper or perhaps on TV, as he's somebody that frequently gets consulted on documentaries as well as news shows for his access to security information. One of his main responsibilities for Symantec is to pull together the content that comes out of Symantec's Global Intelligence Network. And as you may or may not be aware, that is a tool that resides within all the Symantec products that are out in the environment and forwards a lot of telemetry data back to Symantec and allows them to have a good handle on what's going on within the entire globe in terms of security and being able to monitor threats, watch them progress, and fight them. And so without any more introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Kevin. I know he has a lot of content to cover, and I want to make sure we give him plenty of time to dive into that. So Kevin, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate this.
Well, you bet. My pleasure to be here. Thanks, everybody. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the threat landscape. And the way we do that is once a year we take all the data that we've collected over the year, which we use to improve our protection capability. But we put it out in this annual report to try to make sense or give some sort of statistical analysis of the threat landscape. So I wanted to share with you some of the highlights of the report. The full report is available, and we would love for you to download it and take a look at it. We'll talk about that at the end. But let's get started talking about some of the highlights. And to do that, I actually wanted to go back to 2012. Back in 2012, Symantec ran a project, we called it Project Honeystick, where we went to major cities and we took cell phones that we had carefully crafted and we left them places where we knew someone would find them and take them. And here is Times Square in New York City, and you can see the phone sitting on top of the newspaper box. Here's Los Angeles, in Chinatown in Los Angeles. One of our folks left the phone sitting there in this gift shop. And here, well, you probably know where this place is. So 5 different cities around the U.S., we left these phones for people to find. We wanted to see what people would do once they found the phones. And we had this nice little project interface here where we were able to track what people did with the phones. And we had banking applications, we had private pictures, we had remote access capability to servers built into this phone, or what looked like it did. And we wanted to see if people, when they picked up the phone, if they actually did any of those things, if they actually tried to log into somebody's bank account having found their cell phone, if they tried to look at a file that was full of private pictures or HR salaries or passwords. And what we discovered is, sure enough, people did. Curiosity is a very, very powerful force, and when people had these phones, and these phones weren't password protected so that anybody could then take and look at what was on these phones when they found them, people did. So it was a pretty interesting project. It showed that everyone that found one of these phones looked at the data on it, and it made a very strong case for doing password protection. So let's flash forward to this year. In the ISTR, we were able to measure the percentage of mobile devices that now have password protection on them. And you can see it's a pretty good number. I mean, for consumers, it's almost 98% and over 98% for enterprise. We'll take maybe a small amount of credit for that kind of test we ran, and we got a lot of good publicity on it, as you can imagine, helping persuade people to do it. But overall, it's nice to see that in general, people have finally understood how important it is to protect those devices. Our lives are on them, that information in our lives, really important to protect it. So that's some good news. So there is good news, and when you look at the threat landscape, usually not a lot, but there's some. I thought we would start with that. But one of the interesting things that we learned as we put this together was that actually the smartphone makes a pretty darn good surveillance device. I mean, you think about it, it's got a microphone, so it's a listening device, it's got a camera, it even has the ability to track where you go with the location awareness. And when we looked at this data that we compiled, we realized that even though we didn't know who this person or who the people were that picked up these phones, we could tell everywhere they went. And if you knew where somebody was at night and where somebody was during business hours in the day, it probably wouldn't be very hard to figure out who that person was. So you could say that, you know, you can anonymize location information, but anybody that cares could figure out who you are. And in fact, this particular display right here, we moved things around. These are not really where the person we were tracking was. Even without any context at all, we thought we had to disguise this information, and of course we ended up deleting it very quickly because this was not our intention when we did it. But this was back in 2012, and this was something that we were really just figuring out. So let's flash forward to 2018 and 2019. This is a screenshot from Google Play. This is one of the more popular applications that are up there. You can do a search, you can find it yourself. It's a flashlight app. This app has been around for a long time, but they kind of change the name, they update it every year. So you get the latest year and the name may change a little bit. But if you go and look at the information about this app, you can see it's been installed over 10 million times. So it's one of the most popular apps that are up on Google Play for Android phones. And of course, it's a pretty good idea. They give you very details about the permissions before you install it. You can check this out as you install it. It'll say, here's the permissions we'd like. So let's look down at the details of the permissions that this flashlight app needs. So the flashlight app needs to be able to read your USB storage if you have it on your Android device. It needs to be able to access your camera. It needs to be able to access your microphone. It needs to be able to track your location, and it needs to be able to look at your photos, media, and files. Seems kind of weird that a flashlight app would need all that capability, doesn't it? So this is something that we began to look into, and we went up and downloaded the top free applications, most popular 100 free applications for both iOS, for iPhones up on the iTunes Store, and for Android. And we looked at what permissions they were asking for because we said, hey, is this flashlight app an aberration or is this kind of common? And you can see that, you know, a few will ask for you to give them your phone number. Quite a few will ask for email addresses and usernames, even your home address. But let's look at these. These really jump out to me. Almost half of the Android apps want to be able to track your location and access your camera, and almost a quarter of the iOS applications. Significant number want to record audio, etc. Now, there may be some legitimate reasons that the app need to do one of these things. The flashlight app, it says we want that permission because when you go to a different location, we can change the color of the flashlight. So instead of white, you can get a red beam or a blue beam. I suppose there's some value in that, but you probably agree with me. I think that's just kind of a feature to kind of convince you it's worth giving permission to let it track your location. So this is pretty significant research, I thought, for us, and give people an idea of, you know, some of the risky permissions that these legitimate apps are looking for. I mean, we worry a lot about malware. We look for malware in the mobile space. We can protect our users, but there's some things that, quote-unquote legitimate apps that we want to make people aware of as well. And these are the free apps. I just thought I'd point another one out. Even that weather app that came on your phone, that is a pretty well-known company behind it. It is going to ask you for permission to track your location. The idea being that if you travel somewhere else, you don't have to go to all the trouble of typing in that new location. The app will automatically add weather for that location when you go there. So that seems pretty legitimate to me, so I can see a really good reason that they would want that. But we came across this data sheet from the company that created that app, and this is a data sheet that it's selling to investors, people who be interested in investing into different companies. And they are actually selling location data in this brochure. So what they're doing is talking about how they have over 200 million downloads of this weather app, and a 90% adoption rate from people who are giving their location. I mean, that's a huge number. And so they're collecting 120 million pings. The app is reporting back somebody's location daily. And so using this brochure, what they're doing is selling that information to investors. Now, why would an investor want that kind of information? Well, let's imagine that you were thinking about investing in say a retail outlet, and you could take the company's word for how many people are going into their stores, or you could hire people, I suppose, to sit outside these stores in cars with a piece of paper and count everybody that goes in. Or you could just buy this data to know how many people are going into each store. And so it would be valuable from an investment standpoint if you were trying to decide whether this company is going to be successful or not. Okay, there was this many people this week, how many people next week, is it growing, etc. Of course, you and I can probably sit there and think of a lot of different uses for this information, and certainly it almost seems like it's a pretty easy way for one company to kind of spy on another company. It's not just you and I can think of interesting ways. Actually, here's an example from the news where a bounty hunters figured out how to use this information, and they could go out and track down somebody's location that they were looking to pick up by using this location awareness data. And in this case, they didn't actually get it from an app, they got it directly from the phone companies. Now, I say directly, that's not quite true. The phone companies sold it to a data broker, who sold it to another data broker, who then ended up selling it to these guys. So the phone companies said, hey, we didn't know this was happening, and they have said they're not going to do that anymore. They're not going to sell that location data. But I haven't heard anything from any of these app vendors, because basically that's their business model. That app is free. That's how they're making money. And it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of talk about privacy laws. Will they help? Do they make a difference? I don't know that they're going to solve everything. But it's interesting if you look at this weather app in the US versus in Europe, where there's privacy laws, GDPR. In the US, they say, hey, we can give you personalized weather information if you allow us to track your location. In the Europe, they'll tell you certainly they're going to give you personalized information, but they're also upfront and transparent about the fact that they'll share that data with partners as described in our privacy policy. So at least there is more transparency in what's going on if you have a well-written privacy law. All right, so let's move into some malware now. One of the big stories in 2017 was the rapid rise of cryptojacking. We saw, I think it was an 8,000% increase in those attacks. It really just exploded in the fourth quarter of 2017. So we've been protecting customers, tracking what's going on since then. I can tell you in 2018, we saw 4 times as many attacks. We blocked a total of 3.5 million of these just in December alone. But that doesn't really tell the whole story. And if you follow the cryptocurrency markets at all, you'll know that the price of cryptocurrency dropped dramatically in 2018. And really, it was a rapid rise of cryptocurrency prices that drove a lot of bad guys towards cryptojacking in 2017. the drop in price definitely drove a lot of these attackers away onto other ways to make money and get rich. So we saw a 52% drop in the number of cryptojacking attacks if you track it over the course of the year. So pretty dramatic. It didn't drop at the same rate as cryptocurrency prices, which is a pretty good indication that not everybody stopped doing it, but a lot of people did. The ones that stayed needed to become more sophisticated and needed to be able to find ways to get more machines to make the same amount of money. So we saw some and have continued to see some interesting repercussions of this. First of all, it's really a move from consumers towards businesses and enterprises who have more resources available that can get hijacked to mine for cryptocurrency. So if I'm a cryptojacker, if I can get into your cloud service and I can use that to mine for coin, I can get as much CPU as I want, because cloud services are set up to do that. And the bill goes to you and I. It goes to whatever the companies are that are paying for these cloud services. So no investment cost on the cryptojacker's part. He's sticking you with the bill while he's making money, and he's getting a very powerful machine to do that. We also see
Kevin,
yeah, go ahead.
Kevin, a quick question about that. Have you found that it may be that the reason that this is happening may be because customers aren't necessarily extending their security infrastructure into their cloud infrastructure or integrating those pieces? Or do you think it's just simply that they're easy and new targets?
Yeah, I think it's easy and new targets. What we're seeing is that as people move to the cloud, they're making kind of the same mistakes we made 10 or 15 years ago on PCs. They're not really paying attention to vulnerabilities. They're not patching them. I'll have an example of that in a minute. They're not configuring these devices to be secure. That is, likely lack of knowledge, not really understanding, the security implications, not really thinking through the need to harden these systems. There's a lot of advantages to the cloud, and if something goes wrong, you can just pull one instance down and put up another one. But that doesn't mean that there's no security risk around them. And I think, this will get better as security around the cloud catches up, and the understanding of the need for it, but we're not there yet. So it's a huge opportunity for the bad guys. We're talking about it here in terms of cryptojacking, but we're seeing it for all types of malwares. If you have a major vulnerability in some piece of software, it doesn't take long for the bad guys to figure out how to take advantage of it. And they will continue until you patch that vulnerability.
Nice.
The other threat to enterprises, of course, is just getting into an organization where you can get to hundreds or thousands of machines and convert them into crypto miners for you. And we're actually seeing the bad guys use typical malware spreading techniques inside of organizations to get as many machines as possible. For instance, the Eternal Blue vulnerability, the one used in WannaCry, has been used to spread inside an organization and get as many machines as possible. Some of the attackers, once they get on, will then take that CPU and use it at 80 to 100% to get as mine and make as much money as quickly as possible. Some are smart enough to say, you know what, I'm not going to run during business hours because somebody will notice that their computer is being taxed and they can't open their spreadsheet very quickly. So I'm going to wait till they go home at night or on weekends, and I'll crank it to 100% then. So again, you've got to be a little bit smarter to make money. That's who tend to be the people that are doing it, coming up with these ideas to try to spread as much as possible and avoid detection. We actually just, a couple weeks ago, discovered a whole bunch of apps that were up on the Microsoft Store that had crypto jackers hidden inside these apps. So the users would download these onto Windows, and the miners would start working, and they'd turn their computers into a miner for a bad guy somewhere. So this, you can spread very quickly getting onto one of these stores. A lot of people will download it, especially if it appears to be free, and you've got a lot of machines very quickly. This is an interesting case that we saw in Brazil. This is error messages from Norton, our consumer product. and that's Portuguese. I can't read that, but the second part of it says web attack JS coin miner. I do know what that is. So that is a JavaScript-based coin miner that is normally hosted on a web server. When the user goes to a web server, and that JavaScript is just going to be just as simple as this that I'm showing here. You get that onto the web server, so you've infected the web server. When a user goes up to the web server, the page gets downloaded onto the client, onto your laptop, into your browser, and so does the JavaScript. And the JavaScript starts running, and it's mining for coin. And as long as your browser is on that page, you're going to be making a bad guy wealthy. So this is clearly what was happening in this case in Brazil. The good news for our customers were we were blocking all these. That's what that pop-up means. But while we tracked this up, and we noticed that there was a huge number of these attacks going on in Brazil. So something was going on, and we needed to investigate further just to figure out what was going on. It actually appeared like hundreds of websites were infected. So we found the malware, we found the code. Certainly you can see it's that simple little script being run. But what it turned out was it wasn't hundreds of websites that were infected, it was actually routers. So when the web page came down from the website through the router to the client, the router added the JavaScript onto the page, and the clients, the laptops, desktops, et cetera, started mining for coin. And it turned out that it was one particular brand of router, and Microtik, which is a company out of Eastern Europe. And it wasn't actually home routers, it was actually ISP routers. There were 12 ISPs in Brazil who had their routers infected. So every one of their customers, when they went to a website, the download was coming back with a JavaScript mining for coin. This is an attacker who made a couple $1 million in a very short period of time. But it's also big and noisy, and we caught him pretty quickly. Right, and we're able to work with the local authorities to get these devices cleaned up and kick this guy out of there. But this is an ongoing problem with these routers. They have vulnerabilities. In fact, if you go up to the Microtik site, they were very well aware of the vulnerability. They had fixed it. They had a patch available in April of 2018. The attacks I was just talking about, that happened in August. So that patch had been available for a very long time, but the ISPs in Brazil had not patched their routers. We're back to that kind of scenario where we're not following the best practices we learned on PCs, on routers or other IoT devices, and the bad guys are taking advantage of it. Now, I'm picking a little bit on Microtik. This is an example, and it is well known by attackers, these vulnerabilities. But it's not just this vendor of routers or IT equipment or IoT equipment where this is an issue. It's really in all of them. Let's look at
Kevin, to that point.
Go ahead. Yes.
I was going to say, Kevin, to that point, this is really interesting to see because this is an enterprise router class when most of the press that I saw this in 2018 was around home routers, the Netgears, the Linksys, the some of those others that that a consumer might buy and just leave unpatched for years. It's interesting to see that that's also across the enterprise routers. Have you seen that more attention has been given to the home users or the enterprise users by the hacking community?
Well, I think you have to remember that when you look at pure numbers, there's a lot more home routers than there are routers sitting in ISPs just because there's so many users. And, one ISP has thousands of users, each of them have a home router. So there's just more of those devices that are out there. And they suffer from the same issues. And in fact, as opposed to an ISP, as a home user, there isn't a home IT staff that's responsible for patching. It's you or me or our mom or dad or cousin or whatever who has probably never even looked at the router since it got installed by the cable company or whoever the ISP is, may not even know that they need to change the password and certainly doesn't know that they need to patch on it. So home routers are extremely vulnerable, but I think the lesson to take away is while those are that's where the big numbers are. It doesn't mean those are the only devices that are at risk. In fact, I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Here's a look at some of the data from IoT devices that we see that have been attacked in 2018. That number, total number of attacks is pretty much unchanged, but the shift was more towards routers and connected cameras. About 90% of all the devices were routers or connected cameras or your webcam. That's up from routers who were about 54% last year, so 75% this year. So big increase in what's being attacked. But let's talk about, you know, this is a lot of the focus, the home router, the home webcam, that security system that's got cameras. It's huge. But is it the only issue? No, it's just not at the same volume. And in fact, we put out research throughout the year on our blog about various attacks and targeted attack groups. And if you look at the ones in the middle, we followed a targeted attack group that was attacking satellites, telecom equipment, defense companies, and another one, the Triton gang, which was going after industrial safety systems. Now, there's not as many satellites as there are home routers. Satellites will never make the top 10 because there's just not the same number. But the consequences of these devices that are connected to the internet being attacked by bad guys is pretty big, right? You're taking down our telecommunication systems, making a factory go offline, or causing some sort of destruction there. These are huge issues. And everything's getting connected to the internet, and with it comes great risk. So there's a lot of details up on our blog if you're interested in these particular attacks. But overall, we really need to start paying attention to protecting these devices. It's really critical to our safety. All right, speaking of targeted attack groups that we do track, quite a few of them. I'll give you the numbers in a minute. What we also have been doing is some analytics on these groups to try to understand what they do. So sophisticated attackers who typically go after only a small number of companies. They're not going after mass attacks after consumers and end users, but they may have 30, 40 to maybe 50 companies specifically that they go after. This is a look at mainly what they do. Now, most of these groups, not all are nation state, and most of it is in intelligence gathering. It's a spy versus spy kind of thing. But you can see that many of them are trying to get financial gain out of this, and there's 10% is disruption. And this is probably the biggest change from last year, where we've actually seen the number of groups that do destruction, wipe out hard drives, try to destroy things, as well as disrupt, have grown significantly. Really about 25% growth over year to year. So this is becoming more and more a part of the arsenal of these targeted attack groups. Here's a look at how these targeted attack groups, well, specifically looking at, do they use zero-day vulnerabilities, which has been, you know, a big story for 10 years now, how these targeted attack groups find zero-day vulnerabilities, something nobody knows about, uses them to get into an organization. They don't do that as much anymore. In fact, overall, at all time, only 23% of the groups that we're tracking have ever used a zero-day vulnerability. They're effective, but they're expensive, and there are much easier ways to get in. The other chart looks at the typical vectors. How many different ways do these folks use? And as you can see, the majority of them just use a single method to get in. They find something that works, and they continue to use it. And the thing that works is spear phishing attacks. So you can see that 65% of these groups use spear phishing email to get into an organization. You got water hole attacks, Trojanized updates, web servers, and so on. But mostly it's spear phishing. It's cheap to do, it's really simple, and it's really effective. It really works. The other way that we're seeing targeted attack groups, we're also seeing just kind of regular attackers use is the supply chain, is using Trojanized updates. They get into a partner to the target. They get into a software vendor for their target. They infect them, and they use them to get into the organization. 78% growth in those types of attacks in 2018. Here's an example of a targeted attack group that we discovered in 2018. This has previously been an unknown group. They do use spear phishing to get into organizations. But let me show you some of the specifics of how they got in. They used a Windows roaming tools task, which was really to schedule PowerShell scripts. They used a reverse TCP payload. They used WinZip as a console to manage what they're doing, and they used the PowerShell library to help create these PowerShell scripts. These are probably not surprising, but when you look at them all together and say, these are the techniques they used to get in there, what's really striking is there was no binary malware used. So if you're searching just for some executable that is known to be malicious, or even haven't seen before but it's malicious, it's not working that way for these guys. They are doing what we call living off the land. That's the LOTL acronym up on the top, where they're using existing tools rather than writing their own. And this makes it very difficult to determine that a threat's going on, because typically you look for malware. That's why some of the new technologies that we have in our products are very important. That's why you hear us talking about machine learning and using artificial intelligence. And that's actually what we use to find this particular gang, to find this targeted attack group and to be able to stop them, because there wasn't the traditional malware to find. Here's a list that typically Symantec does discover a number of targeted attack groups every year. We don't discover all of them every year, but we do our share. You can see Galway was one of 4 that we discovered last year. Another group that we been tracking is the Lazarus group. If you're not aware of them, the short answer is they were involved in the attack against Sony Pictures 2014. They stole $81 million from a Bangladesh bank in 2016. They were responsible for the WannaCry attacks in 2017. And the U.S. government said, hey, the Lazarus gang is actually a part of North Korea. It's linked to the North Korean government. So we discovered them doing something else last year. And I think this is a really good example of some flawed thinking that people have in security. They decided that they wanted to make some money. They are one of the gangs that do destruction and disruptive. They do intelligence gathering, and they also do financial crime. And they decided to go after the ATM network. But instead of looking to go after the ATM itself, which is pretty typical, they went after the server, the payment server at the bank that serviced these ATMs. So typically in an ATM, you go in there, you put in your card, you make a request. That goes through something called the PAN, or the primary account number. Your primary account number goes to the server on the back end. It looks up to see, do you have as much money as you're asking to take out? Will we allow you to do it? You either get a decline, so you don't get your money, or you go, yeah, you're good for it, and you are allowed to withdraw that money. Well, as I said, the Lazarus gang attacked the server. They put a Trojan on that server, and that Trojan simply said, hey, when one of our people comes up with that particular PAN number, let them take out as much as they want, right? So they rigged the system by getting back into the server, the back-end server itself. So the security problem here, obviously letting a Trojan onto the system, but the big thing here is that these systems were being run over from AIX. AIX is a very old Unix-based operating system, and I feel that this falls into that, people that feel comfortable with security by obscurity. It's an ancient operating system. It's no longer supported. You can't get updates for vulnerabilities. It just doesn't happen anymore. And to think that, well, it's safe though because nobody remembers it or nobody knows anything about it, just, in this case, proves to be not true. You just can't use security by obscurity to protect yourself in this day and age. So I think that's a pretty good lesson for all of us. It's a hard lesson that the bank learned. Okay.
That's an interesting one, Kevin, if I can jump in. I know that we've got several customers who are approaching us about the fact that they have some legacy systems that they rely on heavily, but again, they're old systems. In some cases, the hardware is no longer supported, or much less the software running on top of it, and they're in this catch-22 situation. How have you seen how some organizations are trying to get around that, other than massive code rewrites?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough problem. I don't mean to smugly wag my finger at anyone. The systems work. That's why you don't change them. And there's massive costs around updating them and shakeout periods to make sure that they work correctly. So there's a real cost involved. But I think I think what's critical is, first of all, you don't assume that just because it's obscure that it is safe, and you really want to look what you can do to harden and isolate these systems to keep them protected. And you are going to need to come up with a plan, or it only makes sense to come up with plans to migrate and move from them. Obviously, there's business decision involved, but there certainly are risks around to holding them there. Okay, I'm running a little late. Let me finish up. Total 155 target attack groups that we're tracking. You can see that that number continues to rise year to year. I wanted to get on to real quickly, let's talk about ransomware. If you look at trends in the last 3 years, more consumers were getting hit than enterprises with ransomware in 2016. That number has continued to shrink, so it's only about 20%. I always looked at that chart and thought, man, what does that look like to me? And to me, it looks like Pac-Man. So let me show you what's happening in the enterprise. While the number of attacks are shrinking, and there are less ransomware attacks last year than the year before, that's completely in the consumer space. We've actually seen a 12% increase in the amount of ransomware attacks against enterprise. And that probably makes sense. First of all, the way that ransomware attackers, and this is a general trend in all attacks, are predominantly email-based. They are sending an email with an Office attachment, and that Office attachment often has a PowerShell script inside of it. In fact, we saw a 48% of all malicious email was using Office files, and that's up from 5% the year before. And you think about it, we all use in businesses email and Office documents. We couldn't function without them. But in the consumer world, you know, Office is not that big. And in fact, many consumers aren't even on Windows anymore. And even if they're reading email as opposed to trading messages in text or through social media, they're not susceptible to a Office file that has a PowerShell script, which is a Windows script. They're just not susceptible to it. It won't run on their phone. It won't run on their tablet. It won't run on some of these alternative devices people are using. So just from there, they're just not as much as risk. But we also know that there's a couple other reasons for this. And probably the biggest one is around the money involved in ransomware. If for a consumer, there's an emotional cost, but there may not be a business or financial loss to having all their files encrypted. And they're looking at, can I afford that to get my pictures back, to get my family photos? Maybe I'll pay anything for my family photos, but maybe I just can't afford to pay that money to get it back. But what we're seeing, unfortunately, on the enterprise and business side, that often it becomes a budget and a business decision and what's cheaper, to get all those files back by restoring them from tape, if my tape backup works, or just paying off the attacker. And so businesses actually really continue to encourage ransomware attackers to target them because they continue to pay ransoms of a very large amount. I mean, why would you go after a consumer when you can get the county of Georgia to pay you $400,000 with a ransomware attack? And I think that's the biggest reason we're seeing this shift.
That's interesting, Kevin. I know that in the 2014 and 15 reports, one of the biggest call-outs was small business being more vulnerable than enterprise. And it seems now that, is it possible that that same consumer device shift is affecting small businesses and causing them to be less desirable than the enterprises? Or is it just, do you see distinctions there between small and large enterprise, or small business and large enterprise?
Yeah, we don't really have that data this year to try to break it down that way. I think that if there are small businesses that are not using Office, or for instance using Google Docs instead, sure, they're less likely to actually, you know, be a victim when the attack comes that way. But I would also warn that attackers, these things kind of move in trends. As you can see, that huge jump in Office, that may change next year, and attackers tend to go where their victims are. So if you say, well, everybody will move off Office to stay protected, well, the attackers are just going to follow them wherever they go. And interestingly enough, when you look at consumers, they're still getting extorted, but it's less likely to be ransomware now, and now more likely to be something like a sextortion scam or something in email where if you don't pay me via Bitcoin, something bad will happen to you. And here's some of the examples we saw in the news. Here's an example of a sextortion scam, which is not new, but it's come back. Right, it's been around forever, but not in high volume. It's in high volume now, and where they try to convince you that they've got video of you doing embarrassing things, and you need to pay them money, or your family and friends will see the video. One of the twists we see now is they'll actually put your password in there. So they've gone into the underground economy, and they have bought your email address, and they've also been able to buy a password you used at one time or another, because that data got breached, right? That data got breached and the bad guys are able to buy that. In fact, if you look overall, traditional phishing that is only just trying to steal your login and password, those numbers continue to go down year to year. Where in 2015, 1 out of every 1,800 emails was a phishing attack. That's up to 1 out of 3,000, right? So there's a lot less phishing. And one of the big reasons is because of all these data breaches, because you can simply buy that information rather than sending out email trying to steal it or fool the user into giving it to you, because for $90 you can get 500,000 email accounts with a password. And that password's probably been used on multiple accounts, so it may help you get into almost anywhere. All right, here's some additional numbers. I'm not going to spend any time on them, but or on email, all this type of information is in the reports. I would encourage you to take a look at that. This specifically is a look at PowerShell usage. I said inside that Word document is a PowerShell script. Very easy to write. All Windows systems can run that PowerShell script. We saw a 1,000% increase in this type of attack. And it's a real challenge because a lot of organizations are using PowerShell. In fact, we only see 1% of all PowerShell scripts that get executed in environments we're protecting are actually bad. So it would be great if we could just block PowerShell script and shut the bad guys out, but we can't because most of PowerShell script is legitimate. And so the bad guys are able to hide among the trees, hide among the good PowerShell scripts, and makes it harder to find them and block them. All right, I want to finish up with taking you back to 2012. This is when we first really started warning people about ransomware. This is before it took off, and we could tell by watching what was going on that this was going to be a big threat. Well, we're seeing something kind of similar today with something called form jacking. So if you're not familiar, you haven't heard it, form jacking is essentially virtual skimming. Now, skimming is when you have some sort of device that you use to steal somebody's credit card information. And that's typically something like in the picture where it's put over an ATM credit card reader or a gas station pump credit card reader. And so it will steal the credit card information. When you slide it, the strip through, it'll still go onto the gas pump, but the bad guy will get it as well. This is the real world. This is a piece of hardware. You can go buy them up on the internet and go and put this on some device and try to steal your own. But it doesn't really work when you're buying something online, right? You can't put that piece of hardware on the web server that is the front end for the retailer. But the bad guys have figured out that actually you can do something equivalent. Without hardware, you can do it with JavaScript. So when you go up to a site, you enter your credit card information to make your purchase. That gets sent off to the website. But if the bad guy's been able to insert a little JavaScript on the website, it can also send all that credit card information off to the attacker as well. So this is something that we saw really grow in 2018 and continuing in 2019. That little dotted line is the trend line. The May big bump was when there were attacks against Ticketmaster, British Airlines, some very large companies. And the end of the year is the Christmas shopping season. But overall, the trend is definitely up. And what we're seeing is that really these attacks go against big companies, but also small and medium, because those servers are probably less well protected. And while you can't get as many credit cards in a short period of time, if you can stay on that machine for a very long time, you can still make quite a bit of money. And here's a little bit of our math saying if you got the top end of what a single credit card with full details was, like the CVV number, which you always have to put in when you're buying online, but you never do at the gas station, well, you only need 10 credit cards for at $45 for a number of months before you can make pretty good money. Let me show you the number of attacks. We're seeing about 5,000 websites a month get these JavaScript attacks inserted into them. Sometimes it's directly into the website. Sometimes it's through a third party, like a chat program that somebody licenses to put on their site. That's a supply chain attack. So about 5,000 a month, mainly small and medium businesses, although obviously there have been large ones. We're looking at about 3.7 million blocks. All right, that's kind of an overview of the ISDR. That's some of the things we're seeing. There's a lot more in the report. Be happy to answer questions about anything we talked about or anything else that might be in the report in the time we have left.
That sounds great, Kevin. And for everybody on the call, please feel free to shoot your messages in. I've been collecting those as we've gone, and I actually have a handful of them for you already, if you're set, Kevin.
Okay, let's go.
When we were talking about the cloud environment, I got a question asked: are we seeing higher vulnerability rates in AWS versus Azure versus Google? Are people just relying on the security of the platform and not verifying and overlaying their own tools?
You know, we actually have not measured that, but typically what we're seeing is when it comes to the platforms itself, the people that are not properly configuring their cloud instances, so they're being taken advantage of because of bad configuration. And the biggest issue is the vulnerabilities in the applications that are being run on there. There's been many instances. I showed you the one with the Dockers. There's been very popular databases that are used that have no vulnerabilities, and so the bad guys usually, we've seen those databases encrypted for ransom purposes. We've seen the data stolen from them, etc., just taking advantage of a known vulnerability that hasn't been patched.
Okay. To that one, there was also a question: are we seeing higher percentages with serverless technologies as opposed to on server, full server technologies when we talk about things such as Docker or Kubernetes or things like that?
Yeah, you know, again, that's not something that we measured. I'm also, you know, somewhat reluctant to get into conversations as which is more dangerous than the other, because everything is dangerous, right? You have to go through everything looking with security in mind. And there's the perfect one hasn't been invented yet, so there's risks in all of them. Anyway. Okay.
We also got a question about types of hackers and what type of damage they cause. For example, nation states versus organized crime versus hacktivism. And a follow-up to that was, do we see them partnering or using each other? And how do we define attribution, or how do we handle attribution? So fairly meaty question there.
Yeah, we of course, you know, see a little bit of everything. Most targeted attack groups are nation state or nation state sponsored. There's certainly cases where there are hacker groups that are for hire, and they may be hired by a nation state or somebody else. We do see the nation states. I think North Korea is a good example of a nation state which, according to the FBI, is the largest group and has stolen information, destroyed websites, but also tried to, you know, or all done things for financial gain. But we do see targeted attack groups that are purely financial. There are a couple that specialize in targeting banks. right? So they don't send out banking Trojans through email. They have particular banks that they can spend a long time trying to break into, understand how things are done inside the bank by getting on machines and watching what the typical people do, and then they start transferring money around. So those would not be associated necessarily with a nation state as far as we know, but would definitely be considered a target attack group because they're just looking at 20 or 30 banks around the world to see which ones they can break into and make great deals of money. As far as attribution goes, we try to stay out of the attribution business and leave that to law enforcement. We certainly develop a lot of information and data and evidence about these groups. And what we have, we do pass over to law enforcement for them to try to go and arrest people. I flashed up a slide on the Symantec gang. I've been talking about them a lot because it's an interesting case. They are, the FBI has identified them and put up wanted posters, but they are Iranian nationals. And they are responsible for a lot of ransomware attacks around the world, including the city of Atlanta and a number of hospitals. We've tracked 67 different organizations they tried to break into just in 2018 for ransom. And we provided evidence on these guys. But you know, that's for somebody else to say, put up the wanted poster and try to arrest them. But it's actually been incredibly encouraging. We've tracked that in reports. There's been a lot more indictments in 2018 than any year before, and we do see law enforcement getting better and better at going after these guys. Maybe in the case of like the Iranian nationals, they may not always be able to get them, but they've been put on notice, and they probably won't be traveling on vacation to any country that has an extradition treaty with us. So I think it's positive.
So the question came up as a follow-up on that one. What about healthcare? Are you seeing any specifics about that people are targeting that in specific or staying away from that in specific, or are they just yet one other industry that has its own unique set of problems?
Yeah, I would say that healthcare certainly has its unique share of problems, but they are a target for ransomware. And I'll tell you that a lot of that is because famously a hospital called Hollywood Presbyterian got hit by ransomware, paid the ransomware extortion gang $17,000. That was widely publicized, and within a couple weeks we saw 2 hospitals in Germany attacked. A couple weeks later we started to see hospitals in the U.S. attacked, and that they have continued to be targeted since. Very publicly paying a ransom kind of waves a red flag and means that all your peers are going to start seeing attacks against it. If you look at municipalities, there have been instances where they have paid, and it has made them a target for these groups. Why wouldn't you go after healthcare or a municipality when there's clear evidence that they will pay you a lot of money if you're able to get on them? So it's really a shame. These really hurt everybody else when that ransom gets paid.
Interesting. So another question we have is about IoT devices, and are you seeing any compare or contrast with home versus enterprise systems? In other words, you know, the PLCs in a flour mill versus somebody just built a new home and they have 50 connected devices ranging from their refrigerator to their home doorbell.
Right. Yeah. In general, you know, if we exclude those target attack groups going after specific devices that we talked about, attacks against IoT devices are generally worms. So worms used to be a big thing, and they just kind of faded away, and now they've come back when it comes to IoT. So essentially, a worm is something that once it gets on one device, one of the first things it does is have that device try to attack other devices. So scan out of the network, find other devices that have the vulnerability that you used to get on the existing device, and continue to spread there. So they're self-spreading threats, which makes them somewhat indiscriminate. Where they kind of turn out targeting is that they will go, for instance, with a known vulnerability. So that they will scan out a bunch of addresses and they will try that vulnerability. Since it is one of those devices that have that vulnerability, they're able to get on it. They will go with a list of default passwords for routers. And so they'll get on the devices where it is one of those routers and the default password hasn't been changed. So that becomes kind of the selection process for what is infected in the IoT space if it is not a specific targeted attack. So yeah, home routers are very vulnerable because people don't change the default password, certainly more often than enterprises don't change the default password. And as we've learned, enterprises have trouble keeping up with vulnerabilities, but at least they have a history of doing it in their environment. Home users probably don't know what a vulnerability is and certainly have never sat down with a router to try to figure out how to patch it with the latest firmware so that there isn't a vulnerability. If they even know what a firmware is, or if the device even has the capability of being updated. So those are the things that kind of more dictate what's getting infected, what type of devices.
Beautiful. Well, I would like to make one last call for questions from our audience. And then while I do that, I'll mention, for those of you who are in the Twin Cities area, I know we've got folks from all over the country, but for those of you in the Twin Cities area, we do actually have an event coming up next Tuesday at the Top Golf location, and we'll be having an interactive discussion about this same topic. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach back and contact us, and we would be happy to extend you an invitation to that event. Meanwhile, I don't see any more questions coming in. So with that, again, I would like to thank Kevin for taking some time out of your day to share some great information with our customers and to give some real insight into where things are going within security. And equally importantly to our customers, thank you for taking the time to spend an hour with us today to talk about some important security topics. Again, my name is Mike Dunham, and my contact info is there on the screen. Please feel free to reach back to me with any further questions. If there's anything you'd like to ask Kevin, I'd be happy to forward your questions to him and facilitate a response. Otherwise, again, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, everybody, for joining us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.